All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Dariush Zahedi, and I am the director of the Berkeley program on entrepreneurship and development in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Price, UC Berkeley's Vice Chancellor for Research, who will deliver the introductory remarks.
Thank you. On behalf of the Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley, I'd like to welcome all of you here this morning, as well as those who are late arriving. This conference is co-sponsored by several organizations, and I want to take, right at the beginning, the opportunity to acknowledge them. From the Berkeley campus, the Religion, Politics, and Globalization Program, the Clausen Center for International Business and Policy, and the Institute of Governmental Studies. From outside the campus, the Tech Wadi, the Bank of the West, you can see by the signage, the Hand Foundation, and the Legititum Institute. But the primary sponsor and organizer of this conference is the Berkeley program on entrepreneurship and development in the Middle East. This is a new initiative on the Berkeley campus that focuses on the question how best to build and sustain open economies, societies, and polities in the Middle East and North Africa. The program focuses on the relationship between the promotion of entrepreneurship and economic development on the one hand, and the attainment of democratic sustainability on the other. The program has decided to devote its inaugural event, an inaugural conference, to the successes and difficulties of the Turkish model and its applicability to the broader Middle East region. Because Turkey alone among the countries of the region appears to have succeeded in combining the development goals of economic diversification, export-led growth, relative equity, middle-class expansion, and poverty alleviation. The goal of the conference is to shed light on some of the features, the macroeconomic features, governance, foreign policy, banking, legal aspects, culture, and institutional contributions to the success of the Turkish model. The aim of the meeting today is to hopefully generate actionable policy recommendations for Turkey's neighbors. With that, let me turn the podium over to my colleague from the Berkeley campus, the director of the Clausen Center for International Business and Policy, Public Policy.
Well, good morning. My name is Pierre Olivier Gourinchas, and I'm the director of the Clausen Center for International Business and Policy, one of the organizations on campus that is sponsoring this event. And so I first want to thank all the participants to the different panels and all the sponsors at Berkeley, on the Berkeley campus, as been mentioned earlier, but also the other organizations that have helped make this event possible. Now, bringing all these institutions under one roof to discuss the role of entrepreneurship in Turkey and in the Middle East, I think promises to offer some exciting intellectual challenge, as well as contrasted views on what is undoubtedly a critical question for the region, but also for the world. How can we ensure a sound and prosperous development in the Middle East? Now, entrepreneurship is a key engine of innovation, and innovation is the only way we know of sustaining improvements in standards of living in the long run. So stimulating entrepreneurship is essential, especially in a region that will eventually have to transition away from natural resources, rents, as a important source of income. So the focus of the conference on entrepreneurship, I think, is especially important and right on target. Now, also as an aside, I think it's especially nice, in my view, that a conference on Turkey is being held in Berkeley, since, as most of you must know, the Golden Gate is not named after the golden color of the hills in late autumn, or even less because of the gold rush in 1849, but in fact, in reference to the Golden Horn of Istanbul. I think the similarities between the natural beauty of the San Francisco Bay and the Bosphorus are quite striking, and so I think it's especially appropriate. Now, I'm not a Middle East expert, unlike many of the distinguished speakers you will hear today. I'm merely a macroeconomist. I'm an international macroeconomist, so I focus on the economy seen from high above and trying to understand some of the deep forces that are at play and some of the fault lines. But since I've been asked to offer introductory remarks, you will have to humor me for a few more minutes and listen to my speculations on the topic at hand. Now, I think the events in the past few years put the Middle East, many countries in the Middle East, at the crossroads. Now, it's not the first time it's been at the crossroads. It's probably not the last. But important choices lay ahead. And the course of events in the next few months or year, in many countries in the region, may decide whether it leaps forward and unleashes its tremendous economic, cultural, and human potential, or falls backward into further social strife, economic dislocation, and political radicalization. In other words, one can put things in context by thinking that Middle Eastern societies who have expressed a strong desire to take their destinies into their own hands have to decide whether, as Bernard Lewis famously put it, things remain wrong or not. Now, economists like myself, when we look at differences in levels of development, economic development across countries, the consensus, by and large, in our profession is that a key impediment to long-term growth lies in the weaknesses of the institutional environment. Institutions above and beyond geography, climate, plain luck, or the skills of policymakers is really what drives economic development. And this is, I think, the key message that comes out from a number of studies, and one that has been emphasized in the work of my colleagues, Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson. Jim actually used to be a faculty member here at Berkeley in the political science department and economics department, in their landmark book, Why Nations Fail. Now, what's interesting from that perspective is when we think about Turkey, is that it presents a pretty unique profile. In a largely unprecedented effort at social engineering in the region, it decided to break with the structure of traditional regimes in the 1920s and embark on a program of secularization and modernization. Now, for many decades, the promise of modernization remained unfulfilled in Turkey, and it exhibited many of the same problems that other countries in the regions had, despite having a different political structure. But in the last decade, it probably started a little bit earlier than that, I would say probably somewhere in the 1980s, the country embarked on a number of economic reforms, and certainly the last 10 years have witnessed a period of remarkable growth, economic development, enlargement of the middle class, reduction of inequalities. In the context also of a political transition and the emergence of the AK party. So it's a very interesting experiment that has been conducted there, and Nevertheless, it's one that remains somewhat isolated. Other countries in the region have not followed on the same path towards development and have rested until recently on more state-dominated strategies or on natural resource rents. So it is, I think, very fitting that we would stop and think for a minute about the experience of the Turkish model. And again, I will let others expound in more details as to what has or has not worked in that context and what lessons are to be learned. And then think about which of these lessons are going to be useful for other Middle Eastern economies as they seek to possibly reinvent their own societies. Now, my second remark goes beyond just the Middle East and Turkey and thinks about the context within which these changes are operating. And I think it's important to notice two things here. One is that we're in the process of what economists call the Great Convergence. That has started maybe 15 to 20 years ago, but it is largely underway now. And that's the process by which the share of economic output, if you want, that is controlled or produced by advanced economies has been declining pretty steadily over time. And projections, even relatively conservative projections extended forward with all the degree of uncertainty that you may want to take when you do such an exercise, indicate that this process will continue. So this great convergence or great rebalancing is under play, and it's telling us that the world is going to become a more multipolar world in the future, much less dominated by the advanced economies. Now, when you look a little bit more closely, you realize that this is the decline in the share of advanced economies is not so much coming from the US, which remains a robust engine of growth, but it's mostly coming from Europe and Japan, and some of it is related to demographic evolutions and some of it to underlying weaknesses in their growth strategies. But that's certainly something that will be taking place over the next decades, and that's the environment within which Middle Eastern economies can, or we hope will succeed in achieving their own economic development. The second important factor, and that is related to the previous one, is the extent to which advanced economies and emerging economies have weathered the recent financial and Great Recession, the financial crisis and the Great Recession. And in particular, it is quite remarkable the extent to which emerging economies have been handling this crisis relatively well in comparison to what happened in more advanced economies. And here I think there is an important lesson. There are actually a couple of important lessons. The first one is that advanced economies remain extremely fragile, and they will remain fragile for an extended period of time. Combination of relatively anemic growth in Europe or Japan, demographic pressures, and the very elevated weight of public and national debt is going to constrain tremendously the kind of economic developments this region is going to, or these countries, in this group of countries, is going to experience in the future. The second point is that for many emerging countries, this crisis was a test. They suffered through various kinds of crises. Turkey actually itself has had its share of financial crisis, upheavals, large economic collapses, followed by recovery. These countries as a group have managed to create sufficient policy space in the last 10 years, alongside with robust economic development. There were very few vulnerabilities on the public sector side in terms of public debt. There were few vulnerabilities on the monetary side with a relatively stable monetary framework, anchored prices and inflation, and relatively robust financial side with few financial vulnerabilities in the form of excessive credit growth, etc. And lastly, relatively small external vulnerabilities in the form of excessive external deficits or external debt. And so all of this policy space has been tremendously helpful in helping emerging economies, such as Turkey, get through this crisis. There is a lesson there that is important, which is that emerging economies and advanced economies are less tightly coupled than before, and crisis in one part of the world does not necessarily have the same impact. There is a danger also that somehow these countries will convince themselves that now they are less vulnerable to crisis and can embark in much more aggressive policies, and that would be also probably very dangerous. And that's something that Turkey is experiencing now. So I wanted to, in my opening remarks, just give you a little bit of a broad overview of the challenges that these countries are facing, the region is facing, and a more general, broader context within which to think about this. So I will stop here. Thank you.